The Old School is brought to you by Ahart Solutions, which provides school surveys and applied research. More information at ahartsolutions.com. And good morning. Welcome to the Old School Podcast, a podcast about the American education system, its qualities, its traits, its problems, its foibles, and maybe solutions to their problems insofar as we know the solutions, but we also dabble in other things, as we will today with history. And with me in this endeavor is my good friend, Dr. Stephen Bourgeois. Good morning, sir.
Herr Miller, it's good to see you and hear you today. Thank you on my behalf for using the word foibles. I was getting a little smile out of that one. You mentioned education, and I think we're going to leave education behind, even though we're
Just a little
talking
bit.
about a little bit, but we're talking about an academic subject,
Sure.
and we do neglect higher ed, honestly.
We do.
We shouldn't, because God knows we spent enough time in higher ed. I don't know how many years I've been in higher ed classrooms. I stopped counting at about 15 years.
Well, with us is that example of that higher ed. He is the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Research, Professor of History at TCU. So dedicated to his craft that he forced himself to spend years at the University of Hawaii, honing his craft, learning the subject. He's written extensively on East Asia and China. We welcome Dr. Peter Worthing. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Ross. Good morning, Stephen. Thanks very much for having me this morning.
We are very happy to have you as well. Before we get into Chinese history, though, I heard a study from the University of Michigan, and I'm ready to claim that this might be a bogus study. I'm not sure. Not because it comes from the University of Michigan. I have no particular axe to grind there, although. But they said they did a study that says for every hot dog you eat, you lose 30 minutes off your life.
Wow.
I don't believe that. I don't know how you would know that.
Well, you read the study. They probably actually had empirical evidence to support that.
Now,
I have heard that processed foods can be bad for you.
yeah, but people have been eating hot dogs for centuries, haven't they?
Well,
I mean, you get a Hebrew National. That's that they answer to a higher authority. That's a kosher dog. That certainly can't take 30
Does that
minutes
include
off.
brats and sausage dogs and all variety, or is it just kind of the processed beef hot dog?
They didn't. The blurb that I read did not specify what kind of hot dog. I think their focus was hot dog, and then to rope in the European crowd, they mixed in a meat pie, saying that also has a rather detrimental effect to your lifespan.
We may need to dig into their methodology on this one before we draw any conclusions.
Yeah, I think we can't accept this study at face value. We do need to learn a little bit about it. So
I would appreciate more granular findings and find out how many minutes you lose per hot dog. That would
And
be.
what about the bun? Does the bun have make a difference?
Yeah,
We gotta work through this one.
So maybe it's a carb thing. Maybe you just had the hot dog with all the toppings on it without the bun. Maybe you're good to go.
How do we know it isn't the mustard that's really doing the damage here?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and accept the lesser time span if it's mustard, because I do like mustard. But anyway, these are the kind of hard hitting things that we talk about here on the Old School podcast.
We could devote a whole podcast to that, but there's something about all beef that I think that's the divider. All beef hot dog, it just feels better somehow.
I think if you're talking about the hot dogs at the ballpark that have like the grayish hue to it,
yeah,
I can kind of see that one. The one they sell for $1 for the dollar hot dog night. I think those will kill you fast. But the Hebrew National, the good hot dogs, I'm not certain.
Thank you, Ross.
That's my official statement on the University of Michigan study. But anyway, I love Chinese history. I love East Asian history. And the one thing that I'm drawn to the most, and Peter, you might have the same feeling, is that anytime I read a survey history book and there's like a major event, but that it's only given very short treatment, maybe a paragraph, maybe even less than a paragraph, I'm automatically intrigued And that is how I came to the Boxer Rebellion. The American minister at the time was a man by the name of Conger, and his wife kept a diary. She talked about the fact that this will be a story that will be told from ages and ages hence. Could you in a kind of a quick elevator speech, talk about why the Boxer Rebellion is important and why it should matter that people study it now?
Well, I think it's important because there were important consequences that came out of this. But I think also in thinking about the origins, it's important because it requires some careful study, just like this discussion we just had about hot dogs. We need to get down into the weeds, into the granular details to really understand what this was and why it happened. But if you just start thinking about the consequences, Ross, I mean, um, this in many respects, some people would describe the Boxer uprising as a turning point. It was the point at which the Qing court finally made a serious decision to move forward with meaningful progressive reforms. And I think a lot of historians would see that as a dramatic change right about 1900.
Mm.
I think you could also argue that in some respects, it marked a bit of a turning point in Western attitudes towards China. The Boxer uprising and the way it was presented to a foreign audience made much of China look absolutely barbaric.
Mm.
And it kind of set the tone for, I don't even know if it changed things, but perhaps confirmed some of the most negative views of China as a barbaric and savage place. And there was a lot of discussion in other countries about, the nature of the Chinese, and it fed into discussions of immigration here in the United States at the time. The protocol that ended the treaty, if you will, that ended the war, saddled the Qing court, saddled China with such tremendous debt at a time when its finances were already, so fragile. So the consequences of this event, I think, were rather substantial, and that's one of the reasons we should know more about it. But as I said, it does require a little more careful inquiry to really understand what it was all about.
So, when you think about, for those of you who do not know, the Boxer Rebellion was a nationalist uprising against foreign influence in China, primarily in the form of missionaries. And missionaries and their converts were pretty much the soft targets that made up the beginning of it. But that's not how the Boxer group started. They did not start as an anti Western group. Is that correct?
Basically, yes. The origins of this movement, and one of the things I should say is that a lot of historians don't like the term rebellion
Mm.
to be associated with this movement. Um, there was a time when people talked about the movement as anti-Qing and then turning to supportive of the Qing. But more recent research has revealed that this movement was never really anti-Qing. So calling it a rebellion against the Qing doesn't really fit. Some people call it an uprising. And if you want to think of it as an uprising against Western influence, that's one way to put it.
Mm.
Other people call it the Boxer War, the Boxer movement. But rebellion doesn't really fit with all of this. And, the origins of this are to be found in the kind of, what shall I say, the context of northwestern Shandong province. I know that sounds like a really small place to begin here.
So,
But if you want to understand,
what part of China is that? When you talk about the Shandong province, where are we talking about?
that's the eastern part of China. It's just south of Beijing, Tianjin, those major cities, and the Shandong Peninsula juts out into the East China Sea.
Okay.
So it's really kind of north central or east central China, if you will. And it's a territory that had suffered terribly. First of all, it was a pretty poor region. The part of Shandong province where the Boxers first emerged was not a prosperous area. It was overwhelmingly agricultural, and it had suffered from a series of natural disasters. It began with some flooding, which prevented good harvests. And then it was in the year 1899, 1900, it was subject to an extended drought. No rain at all for a long, long period, over a year. And the result was, hunger, famine, scarcity of resources, and quite frankly, a lot of young men who were sitting around unhappy with nothing to do but to try to figure out who was to blame for all of this. And some of these young men were drawn to this practice that was not uncommon in different parts of China, whereby groups of men would get together and practice a kind of martial art. So a lot of these young guys who had nothing to do and nowhere to go started practicing this kind of martial art, which, of course, Westerners called boxing, like John L. Sullivan style. And then there developed this practice whereby some of these guys came to feel that they could be possessed by spirits. So spirit possession was a big part of this boxer movement. And these guys started believing that they could be taken over by spirits that through a certain process of incantations and certain practices that I could describe. They could be possessed by a demon, by a god, by a ghost or something. And it started out, they had certain healing powers, and then it developed into this idea that they could render themselves invulnerable to weapons, especially Western weapons. And from there, Ross, to answer your question more briefly, it turned into a movement that started to target the Christian community, mostly Chinese Christians, as you, I think, rightly pointed out. And it would eventually develop into a kind of all-out Western, anti-Western movement. But it really began with a group of young men who were angry, who were idle, who were hungry, and they developed this set of beliefs that grew out of the special context of their popular culture in that region of Shandong and ended up bringing them into conflict with Western missionaries and Christian converts in China. And those are really the origins of it.
So, Peter, was that localized? Did it ever, the notion ever spread to other parts of China?
It did spread, Stephen, but in a very kind of contained area. For example, it spread into neighboring Zhili province. Today in China, we have Hebei province, but at the time, the late Qing and Republican period, that province was known as Zhili. So it spread into neighboring Zhili, where Beijing is. It would spread into parts of Shanxi province nearby and a little bit into Inner Mongolia. But that was really it. In other parts of China, this movement didn't really catch on. And part of this was because these young men eventually determined that the source of their problems was the Westerners, Western imperialism. And so they tended to gravitate towards two major cities where these Westerners congregated, Beijing and Tianjin. And from their locale, it made sense to move in those areas. And it never really, they could very well have gone south and found Christians that they could attack, Chinese Christian converts. But instead, they moved towards those two major cities. So the major activities of the Boxers were in these areas, Shandong, Zhili, and there was some spread into other areas, even into Manchuria in the northeast. But those were the real centers of it, and it didn't really spread beyond that regional location.
Well, there's certainly a lot of examples in history of what happens when bored young men and try to find something to do with themselves. We have plenty of examples within the 20th century as well. I'm curious as far as is there anything that the Boxers could have drawn on as either inspiration or motivation from previous incantations of Chinese history to do what they did?
That's an interesting question, Ross. And historians are always looking back for precedent or events that had an influence on later events.
Mm.
And some historians have really tried to connect the Boxers to other movements. The most frequent connection is made to a group called the White Lotus sect.
Mm.
There was a White Lotus uprising against the Qing in the late 18th, early 19th century. And it took place in parts of North China. And this was a kind of quasi-Buddhist millenarian uprising where these guys thought that they were going to rise up, overthrow the existing power structures, and create this kind of new age. It was largely informed by Buddhist thought. And many people looked back at that and said, well, there must be a connection here between the Boxers and those folks. Or, you could even look back to the Taiping or something like that.
Right.
Taiping, obviously, influenced by Western Christianity. Boxers, obviously anti-Western, but still one might make some connections. But the people in the West, at least, who have done the best studies of the boxers, including a man named Joseph Eschrick, who taught for many years at the University of California at San Diego, he would argue, and I think he's quite correct, that there really is very little connection between the boxers and these other movements that you might find in early Chinese history. And this movement that I've just described really was, in many ways, rooted in the context and the popular culture of Shandong province and the conditions as well. Obviously, the drought, the environmental crises played a huge role. So I think it's interesting to reach back and look for those connections. But I think most of the best scholarship on this particular topic would argue that there are really very few such connections, and that this was in many ways a kind of unique experience, a unique event in modern Chinese history.
And from a history standpoint, I guess that makes it even more astounding, the event, because very seldom do things pop up in isolation absent
Exactly.
of that kind of inspiration.
Yeah.
So Ross, you wrote about this in your master's thesis, and so this is a topic near and dear to both of you. Um, and I'm sure the two of you have talked about that at some point. But I'm curious, Ross, why you were drawn to the topic.
I guess I was drawn to the topic from kind of a diplomatic and the U.S. centric viewpoint. My thesis was basically that the Boxer Rebellion represented a coming out party for the Americans as a world power, and that this is really the first time. And you could also really say this of the Japanese as well, that the Japanese really kind of afforded themselves well and really impressed a lot of the Europeans, but it was the Americans who kind of shift from a regional power to a potentially more global one. Would you say that, Peter, would you say that the kind of the dynamics of world power and that sort of thing, do you think that kind of represents a big kind of consequence of the war, or do you think that we should be more focused on how China changes and what happens to China going forward? Does the Boxer Rebellion have that kind of impact that it would necessitate a more China-centric view?
I'm always in favor of a more Sinocentric view of things,
Mm,
but that's because I study China and I'm
mm,
very much concerned with trying our best to see things and understand things as the Chinese did themselves, as
mm,
opposed to, as you pointed out, Ross, taking kind of an Amerocentric view or a Western-centric view of these
mm.
things. But I tend to view this Boxer uprising as an important event in and of itself, but I like to place it in this larger context of transition that was taking place in East Asia. And you've made reference to it. The rise of Japan as a regional power, the Japanese, eventually the Boxer movement or uprising, whatever we want to call it, is going to be put down by an alliance of foreign forces, of which the Japanese comprised about 50%. Wow. So the Japanese played a significant role in actually putting down this movement. And in many respects, people were impressed with the discipline and the capabilities of the Japanese, as you suggested. But this was a time when East Asia was in transition to what I like to call the Sino-centric world. And I know you've heard me talk about this a little bit. Was kind of collapsing. The world in which China was this great center for East Asia, and that the system created by China provided stability and order, and the manner in which most states understood the hierarchy, the order of things, was collapsing, and a new order was emerging, and people didn't quite know what that new order was going to look like. And that may be extended to this larger international situation in which states like the United States were starting to emerge. Certainly, this was an opportunity, and I shouldn't say opportunity. This was a case in which the United States projected its military power
Mhm.
overseas in China. Later on would come World War I, where the United States would again do this. I suppose we could talk about the Spanish-American War in Cuba and all that. This was a period during which the United States was beginning to emerge and just send its forces out into these different areas. And I tend to see all of that within the context of this flux in East Asia, the kind of decline of China, the rise of Japan, Korea caught in the middle, imperialism, ecological change, economic difference, economic changes. All of this was coming together to create this new order. And in 1900, the period we're talking about right now, nobody really knew what it was going to look like. And it's a fascinating period of change.
So can you both talk about, just flesh out what this conflict uprising looked like and how it played out when it actually came to blows?
Well, I think in the beginning, I think it was what the Boxers did was they kind of concentrated their efforts on kind of outlying Christian areas. There was a couple of missionaries that were killed, like on New Year's Eve, I think of 1899, and then that kind of snowballed from there. And then what it did was it created some panic among Chinese converts. It created some panic among some missionaries, and many of them started to make their way to Beijing to be housed in the consuls and the embassies where they might feel more protected. And then, unfortunately, what that did was that allowed the Boxers, as Peter was saying, to concentrate their efforts just in a couple of spots so that it would make it easier to maybe produce the most damage. Is that a fair assessment, Peter?
I think it is. But one of the things I think is important is to understand exactly why they targeted the missionaries and the Chinese Christians. And to understand that, I think you need to know a little bit more about the history of imperialism in China. And of course, I think a lot of people understand the impact of the Opium War, the Treaty of Nanjing. And there were other cases in 1894-95. The Japanese defeated the Qing court, wrested some territorial privileges, some economic and political privileges from the Qing court. So this whole thing took place in this larger context of imperialism. But were these young men that I've described, were they aware of all this? Were they well informed and cognizant of this larger picture of imperialism? Probably not. But what they were aware of is that there was this missionary penetration of their part of China. And they could see that there were certain Chinese who were benefiting from this. In other words, there were some Chinese who went to the missionaries and were able to get fed. And so they kind of resented the fact that these missionaries came in and, to a certain extent, from their perspective, basically bought converts. You've perhaps heard the term rice Christian. That implies that someone went to the missionaries simply to get a good meal and embraced their religion simply for sustenance. The missionaries and the Christian churches also kind of wielded a certain degree of power in the region that the other folks resented. For example, I sometimes do this in class with my students. Let's just say for a second, Ross, you're a young father, and you're an agriculturalist, farmer somewhere in Shandong province, and the drought has prevented you from harvesting any crops. You just can't make a living, and your family is starving, right? What are you going to do? Well, you're going to probably steal something. Let's just say you have no alternative but to steal. So you go and you steal rice from another family, and everyone knows you did it. We know full well that you did this. You were seen, you got caught, and you run away to the missionaries and claim that you want to join the church. Well, when we come to pursue you for having committed a crime against another family that was also hungry, by the way, the missionaries say, no, I'm sorry, Ross is one of our flock. He enjoys our protection. And so some people some people use the church to avoid justice from the Chinese perspective. The other villagers would see it that way. And sometimes these missionaries became a law, or the churches rather, became a law unto themselves. They would have their own courts. They would impose punishments on individuals in the community as they saw fit, outside of the normal forms of justice in the community. And they sometimes punished people. And there are pictures of people being lashed to flagpoles for a certain period of time and, being punished by the Christians and the missionaries. And so these kinds of things help build resentment. Sometimes they built the churches on the location of raised Taoist temples or Buddhist temples or local, what we sometimes call village god temples. And so they kind of angered the local community because they were prosperous, because they exerted their influence around the area. And that made them targets of some people. And so it was kind of a natural thing for these angry, frustrated, idle young men to look at those people who tended to be different, who tended to be more prosperous, and blame them for their own problems. So they started to talk about, well, the problem with the drought is because heaven is upset that these Western missionaries and their foreign ways are taking over. And so that's how they kind of transitioned from this, gee, I'm unhappy, gee, I don't have a job, I can't feed my family, to I think those Christian guys are responsible for this. And that's where they really began taking out their frustrations and targeting these Christians in the kind of attacks that Ross was describing. And ultimately, it moved from Christian converts in Shandong and Zhili province to the foreigners who inhabit places like Tianjin and Beijing.
It's interesting because it kind of lends to the idea of how unique the Boxer uprising, rebellion, whatever you want to call it, is, because there's plenty of examples. If you're a religious history student, you know about the French in Canada, you know about the Spanish in Latin America. This is a pretty much a standard modus operandi as far as like how you get converts and how you kind of establish yourself, and also how you kind of diminish what everyone else is doing natively, locally, to try to get more people in. But it was only in China to this degree that you see this reaction.
Yeah. And this case is really kind of remarkable and unique when you think about it. When you were just talking, Ross, I was thinking about the Taiping movement, Taiping uprising, which was indeed against the Qing court. And one of the great questions has always been, well, how many people really believed Mr. Hong Xiutren's version of Christianity? How many were true believers? And how many followers were just people who thought, hey, this might ultimately be good for me.
Yeah.
I might get something out of this. It's impossible to know. In the Boxer uprising, there was no leader. There was no visionary leader who attracted people. It was literally a case in which anybody could achieve godlike status. Anybody, through these rituals, incantations, had the ability to become a god, so to speak, had to be possessed by a god. And so you had this kind of mass movement of young men, mostly. There were women, some women involved, but probably 95 or 98% young men who were basically on their own to decide what they were going to do and how they were going to do it, and each of them kind of going through their own religious experience, so to speak. So there was no coherent ideology. There was no coherent leadership. There was no organizational structure that guided any of these guys. It was all like this just massive ad hoc movement in which all of these young people began to engage in this kind of spirit possession practice and gravitated towards these major cities that produced this uprising. So in that sense, I really do think this Boxer movement is really kind of unique in all of this.
Yeah, I've never heard anything like it. I mean, typically there is a strong, present leader to do anything, particularly a military type operation. Um, so to go back to what I was alluding to, how did it play out? Once it all started.
Well, I would think that most of it has to do with, and this is where, and Peter, maybe you can help here, and the degree to which, when the Boxers began to lay siege on the embassies in Beijing, to what degree were they helped, assisted, or otherwise aided by the government? I think many people think that by the end they were helped by the government, but did it start that way?
That's a great question about when you bring the government into this. The Qing court had to figure out how to handle this, and it was a problem. The reality is, I think the Qing court was divided. And to go back to an earlier point I made about this period of transition, there were disagreements at the highest levels of the Qing government over how to move forward. There were those who believed, we need to change, we need to reform. And in 1898, there was a movement in China called the 100 Days Reform. It was led by a couple men. One of them was Kang Youwei, another was Liang Qichao, and they had all these ideas for reforming China, changing the examination system, changing the government, changing the economic structure, changing the communication systems, essentially using Western knowledge, technology, Western political models to try to make some changes to strengthen the Qing government. There was another faction that was adamantly opposed to that. Said, no, the answer is not to embrace things foreign. The answer is not to mimic these Westerners. The answer is to go back to what made us great. The answer is to go back to our own traditions. Now, some of these officials were Manchus, some of them were ethnically Chinese. But with regard to China, within the Qing Empire, they looked to the traditional Confucian practices as a source of strength. So their answer was don't change things. Go back and regenerate, moral regeneration. Go back to Confucianism, go back to the traditions, and that will make us strong. That's what always made China strong.
And so when you look at how then the Chinese the boxers start to kind of they're motivated by the same kind of idea. It lends credence to the notion that that initial laying of the siege of the legation area, it seems so complete in many ways that this is one of the reasons why I think some people believe that fairly early on, at least militarily, that the military may have been involved to kind of help organize what was happening. And then once the German minister von Kletterer was killed, this was the ambassador from Germany that wandered out into the town to try to talk to somebody within the Chinese government. The next thing you know, he ends up killed. That kind of intensifies the kind of the nascent stages of that siege. And now it's a question of you have two things happening. One, you're trying to survive within the legation because you got a bunch of people flooding in, trying to get to it, although they can't after some point. And then you're also trying to push back, fight back. And this is why many people think that the government, at least the military, was assisting the boxers in trying to kind of starve out this legation group.
Yeah. I think the government was split, and those who might be considered pro-boxer were more of the conservative type who didn't want any real change. And they had the upper hand at court. But even for them, this was a difficult decision. I mean, if you suppress these guys, you got all these young men who are running around causing disruption. If you suppress them, the risk is you make it worse. That it just encourages them. They claim they're being suppressed and they redouble their efforts. If you support them, you run the risk of provoking the Western powers. So it really was a difficult situation. And ultimately, I think the Qing court decided that they didn't really have any choice. And this is something that's interesting, Russ. A lot of people think about the Qing court declaring war on the Western powers in the midst of all this. The Western powers started to get really nervous about this, as you suggested, and they started doing things like calling up more guards from Tianjin, like massing some warships off the coast of Tianjin opposite the Dagu forts. And so that kind of led the Qing court to think, oh my goodness, war is inevitable. And that kind of pushed things along a little bit. But throughout the Boxer movement, a lot of Qing officials were either unclear about what to do or unsure about what to do because the court was never clear. And so a lot of them just stayed out of it. And, you probably know, Ross, at one point they sent in food and vegetables to the foreign legation. There was a bit of a ceasefire and they allowed them to bring in supplies. And many of the Qing military units that were supposedly involved in the siege did so rather half-heartedly, did not allow the Boxers to use their weapons and such. So, the whole idea that the Chinese government or the Chinese bureaucracy supported the Boxers is not quite, the degree to which they supported them is not quite clear. And made a big difference in how this thing played out, Stephen, to go to your question.
Mhm. So the next phase of that is when the foreign powers came in, and what happened? How long did this last?
It's a pretty quick affair. Um, we're talking probably from about mid-June to mid-August, so I call it about a month.
Mm.
And a group of soldiers from 8 different countries marched from Tianjin, from the coast, Tianjin, all the way up to Beijing, uh, destroying and burning villages as they went, and ultimately rolled into Beijing, relieved the siege on the legation there, and the leaders of the Qing court basically fled. They left town, left a few officials back to put the pieces back together and sign the peace treaty. But the actual military campaign that ended this affair was quite short, but very bloody.
You especially consider that, one of the things that might perhaps helped expedite the end of the war was, one, how close the Americans were. They were in the Philippines, and so their navy was fairly close by. The British, of course, were fairly close by. The Japanese, the Germans, the Italians, the French, perhaps less so, and that's why their legations are typically smaller than these other ones that are being mentioned. But I think, you poke a bear, and then if the bear happens to live nearby, it's going to be a potential problem for the boxers to be able to withstand that. I mean, I think, again, you go back to how unique this is. The fact that the boxers were able to pull this off for as long as they were able to, when you basically have farmers rising up, desperate farmers, and I think about, the Golden Meir quote, our secret weapon is that we have no other place to go. And when you think about these Chinese farmers, I mean, they're pretty much in the same boat. They have no other resources. You eloquently put it, Peter, about the conditions that existed and the things that they were facing. Still, it makes it a kind of a remarkable chapter to look into.
It does. And that their kind of their lack of organization, their lack of coherent ideology, that was their great strength. It allowed for this movement to spread quite informally and rapidly, but it was also their great weakness, because when the Western powers showed up with significant force, as you pointed out, Ross, they were done. They were scattered, and it was incredibly violent to put them down. But a lot of these young men, put your life on the line. Well, I don't have a whole lot to lose, do I?
Right.
And that really is an important factor in all of this.
Is there a difference in how the nationalists looked back at this compared to the communists? When you look at the history of China after the Boxer Rebellion, you have a short period of time where the nationalists are in charge. They are a kind of a quasi-republic style of government, and then you go into the communist era that begins in 1949. Is there a difference in how those two ideologies viewed this, and was it used differently by the two?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. There's a great book by a man named Paul Cohen. It's called History in Three Keys. And the book has 3 parts. And the third part is about how the Boxer movement has been used by different groups, or how it has been interpreted by different groups at different times. And that, I think, relates very clearly to what you're asking. And it's used in different ways by different people. It has been used in different ways by different people. For example, in the 19 teens, there was something called the New Culture movement, where a lot of young people, sometimes it's called the May 4th movement. They're actually different, but related. A lot of young people were looking for new ideas and such. And during that movement, there were a lot of intellectuals who pointed to the Boxers and said, that's the old China. That's the problem. Barbarism, ignorance, superstition. That is what we need to move away from. We need to move towards rational thought, scientific method, progress, democracy, like the Western states. That's what we need to do. So they criticized the Boxers. Then other people like Sun Yat-sen, some of the nationalists you referred to, Ross, they came along and they said, well, okay, yeah, it was kind of an ugly event, but you know what? These guys were nationalists, and they were reacting to foreign imperialism and the harm it did to China. And so in that sense, these guys were heroes. These are, let's acknowledge that these guys were patriotic folk who were trying to help China. Say what you want about their beliefs or their superstitions or whatever, spirit possession. They were trying to make things better for China, and we should respect that. Then you get Mao Zedong who comes along. Mao Zedong was a great fan of rebels. He liked people who went against the grain. And during the Cultural Revolution, the boxers were held up as examples for the Red Guards. You know, they to rebel is justified, Mao would say, and the Red Guards were smashing things, and the boxers had destroyed things, and so there was a connection there between what was happening in the Cultural Revolution and what happened in 1900. So different people at different times have found different uses for the boxers.
A little bit for everyone.
That's
Well, I would love to push it forward even beyond that, because it seems like there were two views on that, and then one took hold later. I mean, you mentioned, Peter, at the beginning that it has so many lasting effects, probably even to today. But can you flesh that out a little bit?
you know, this was a very unique event. I shouldn't say very unique. It was a unique event. I don't know what the difference is between unique and very unique. A unique event. However, I think later Chinese governments, for example, the contemporary government, can look back on this and worry about it. There have been different movements from within the People's Republic of China, and the obvious example is the Falun Gong movement, which you may have heard of, where these people have kind of their own unique religious views. And there are what we call, I guess, underground churches in China that are pretty common. And when the government of the People's Republic of China looks at these, it tends to see them in this historical context. And it's not just the Boxers, it's also the Taipings and others that have kind of at times risen up with some kind of religious grounding and posed a problem. So I think the Chinese government is less tolerant of certain forms of dissent and is willing to use authoritarian means to preserve stability and order, as the government would put it. And I think some of that is fueled by this history of these kinds of movements, including the Boxers. So, Stephen, I don't know if they look back at the Boxers in particular, but I think the Boxers kind of represent the possibility of an internal movement that could be difficult for the Chinese. I also, I wonder sometimes in the contemporary period right now, there are references to online activity in China, and a lot of that online activity is very anti-American. And sometimes I wonder if, the Chinese government, a little bit of anti-Americanism helps. A Chinese leader needs to be seen as strong on, drawing the line with the United States or maintaining its relationship with the United States. Being adversarial there is not a bad thing for some Chinese politicians or Chinese authority figures. But at the same time, I wonder if they worry about an internal movement that gets out of hand. In other words, if there's this online population that all of a sudden emerges as just violently anti-American or anti-Western, at what point might that become a problem? I mean, the Qing authorities looked at the Boxers and they thought, you know what, some of these guys are just defending their villages. Oh, fine, there's some disorder. We don't have the resources to keep order. If these guys want to form their own little militia and keep order, that's fine. And a lot of officials turned their blind eye to the Boxers, kind of claiming, well, they're just trying to keep order. But at a certain point, they get out of hand and they cause bigger headaches for the government. I wonder sometimes if the current PRC government doesn't worry a little bit about that.
Do you think, to a degree, we talked about the fact that different governments have used different angles of this to kind of justify whatever they do? Whether you call the Boxers patriotic or what have you. Do you think it is fair to call the uprising a populist movement? And in the same vein that someone might look at, the rebels in Mexico in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, whether you're talking about something like the Arab Spring more recently, where the philosophy of the people in charge runs afoul of the practical conditions on the ground, which spurs on some of these groups.
I think there's definitely a populist aspect to all of this. Now, again, sometimes when we think of populism, we think of this kind of widespread movement. And we've already established that there were certain geographic parameters to the Boxer movement. But within those parameters, this was very much a populist movement. And they didn't always see themselves in conflict with the government. They weren't running around claiming that the Qing was doing all this. They were actually supportive of the existing order. And they blamed the Westerners for corrupting that traditional uh,
Hmm.
cultural context that that they had seen as from their perspective was being destroyed or disintegrated in all of this. But it was incredibly widespread and it was incredibly easy. Um, you mentioned the Arab Spring, and I think of the use of technology and the use of WhatsApp in terms of spreading that movement. The Boxers obviously didn't have any technology; they didn't have WhatsApp, but the ease with which anyone could engage in this movement. You watch somebody do it, you learn how to make the spells, you learn the incantations, and boom, you're a part of it. It does seem to me that the facility with which this spread, the ease with which this could be embraced by different people at the lower levels of society, clearly to me indicates this kind of populist aspect to all of this.
All of this out of a single paragraph in an AP US history book or an AP world history book or what have you. It goes to prove just how much history lies behind seemingly innocuous events that is barely thinly covered in a typical, and you can't cover everything. You can't discuss everything to any great detail, but it does kind of show not just the richness of history, but also the risk of or the problems with maybe overgeneralizing or over trying to over synopsize something because you end up losing a lot in the process.
Yeah, that's the great challenge for all of us who were in the classroom, isn't it?
Yes.
Choices. What do you include? What do you leave out?
Mm.
How much do you talk about this? How much do you talk about that? And to bring Stephen at the beginning, I think you said we weren't going to talk too much about education, but that's a perfect segue into this. How do you do this? How do you make the right choices for your students about what you do in class or what you put in your writing? It's a challenge.
I'm still a little troubled, and this is more of a philosophical question, but why would Ross steal that rice, and not generalize his action as a universal imperative? Uh, I'm wondering about that, Ross. You need to explain yourself.
I can't explain it. I can only I can only detail it for you, but it, so who knows? I don't know. But Peter,
He
I'm
didn't.
so
I didn't mean to put you on the spot
No,
with that one.
he didn't stand up for questioning there either.
I buckled like a cheap lawn chair. So anyway, Peter, I'm so happy that you were able to join us today, and I hope that this is only the first of many conversations. I think
Indeed.
if anything, it shows how many layers there is left to peel back to be able to truly understand something to the degree that you can ever understand anything. But certainly there is a lot more that we could do and a lot more we could talk about to get to the heart of the matter.
Absolutely. I enjoyed this discussion very much.
Well, with that, we shall say, by the way, keep in mind, dear listeners, we are on Instagram at the Old School Podcast 2021. I hear all the cool people are on Instagram, so we decided to join as well. So follow us on that, leave a comment, share any of the episodes that mean something to you, and even share the ones that don't mean anything to you, because those are great as well. And particularly share this episode
Indeed.
with Dr. Peter Worthing from TCU. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. Dr. Bourgeois, I shall say adieu.
Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Miller. Peter, thank you. And love the conversation.
Thank you both very much. I enjoyed it.